The auctioneer's hammer fell with a crack that echoed through the frozen January morning of 1882. And Tessa Zimmerman watched her entire life being sold to the highest bidder in the town square of Downeyville, California, where ice clung to the wooden buildings, and her breath came out in white clouds that disappeared as quickly as her hopes. She stood at the edge of the crowd with her threadbare shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her dark hair whipping in the bitter wind that swept down from the Sierra Nevada mountains. The wagon that had been her home for the past 3 months, since her father died, sat on display like a wounded animal, its canvas cover patched and worn, the wooden wheels caked with mud and snow. Everything she owned was inside that wagon, every memory, every piece of her father's legacy, and now it was being taken because she could not pay the debts he had left behind. $50, called a man she did not recognize, his voice rough as gravel. 60, countered another. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson with a thick mustache and calculating eyes, gestured dramatically. "Come now, gentlemen. This is a fine wagon, sturdy construction, good wheels. Surely it is worth more than $60. Tessa felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. She was 22 years old and had already learned that tears solved nothing in this hard country. Her father, Thomas Zimmerman, had died 3 months ago from pneumonia that settled in his lungs during an early snowstorm. He had been a prospector, always chasing the dream of gold that brought so many to California, and he had died with nothing but debts to his name. The shopkeepers had been patient at first, but winter was cruel and money was scarce, and now they wanted what they were owed. $75, came a new voice, deep and steady. Tessa looked toward the sound and saw a tall man standing near the front of the crowd. He wore a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she could see the strong line of his jaw and the serious set of his mouth. She had seen him around town before, always quiet, always watching, but she did not know his name. 80, the first bidder countered, sounding irritated. The tall man did not hesitate. $100. A murmur ran through the crowd. $100 was more than the wagon was worth, and everyone knew it. Henderson's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he raised his hammer. $100 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 110? Silence fell over the square. The first bidder shook his head and stepped back, clearly unwilling to go higher. Henderson waited, drawing out the moment, then brought his hammer down with finality. Sold to Wade Nelson for $100. The name meant nothing to Tessa, but she watched as the man called Wade Nelson approached the auctioneer, pulling bills from his pocket and counting them out with careful precision. Her stomach twisted with despair. Where would she go now? What would she do? The winter was far from over, and she had no family, no friends who could take her in. The small amount of money she had earned washing clothes and mending for the townspeople would barely buy her a week at the boarding house. And then what? Henderson took the money and handed Wade Nelson a piece of paper, some sort of receipt or bill of sale. The crowd began to disperse, people hurrying back to their warm homes and shops, eager to escape the biting cold. Tessa remained where she was, frozen not by the weather but by the weight of her circumstances. She needed to get her personal belongings from the wagon before the new owner took possession. Her mother's Bible and the few photographs she had, her father's watch, and the quilt her grandmother had made. She forced herself to move, walking toward the wagon with leaden steps. Wade Nelson was there already, examining the wheels with a critical eye. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered from time spent outdoors, but there was something gentle in his expression that surprised her. "Excuse me," Tessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me, sir. I need to collect my belongings from the wagon." He straightened and turned to face her, and she saw recognition in his eyes. "You are Miss Zimmerman." It was not a question. She nodded, hugging herself against the cold. "Yes, I just need a few minutes to gather my things, and then the wagon is yours." Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite read. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her worn dress and thin shawl, the hollows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of too many missed meals, the proud way she held her head despite everything. Then he did something that shocked her completely. He held out the bill of sale and said, "Now you are free." Tessa stared at him, not understanding. "What? The wagon is yours," Wade said simply. "I bought it so you could have it back." The words made no sense. She shook her head, confused and wary. "I do not understand. Why would you do that?" He folded the paper and pressed it into her hand, his fingers warm against her frozen ones. "Because it is wrong for a woman to lose everything in the middle of winter. Because your father was a good man who deserved better than to die in debt. Because you should not have to suffer for circumstances beyond your control." Tessa looked down at the bill of sale, her hands trembling. "But you paid $100. I cannot possibly repay you." "I am not asking you to," Wade said. His voice was firm but kind. "Consider it a gift if you must consider it anything at all." She felt the tears she had been holding back begin to fall, hot against her cold cheeks. "I do not even know you. Why would you help me?" Wade was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his words were measured and thoughtful. "My own father lost everything once when I was a boy. A bad investment, a business partner who cheated him. We would have starved if not for the kindness of a stranger who gave him work and a place to stay. I have never forgotten that, and I swore that if I ever had the means to help someone else, I would. Now I do, and you need help, so it seems like a simple enough equation." Tessa could not speak. She clutched the paper to her chest and looked up at this stranger who had just given her back her life. He was watching her with those steady gray eyes, patient and calm, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her response. "Thank you," she finally managed, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. "Thank you so much." He touched the brim of his hat in a slight gesture of acknowledgement. "You are welcome, Miss Zimmerman. Now, do you have somewhere warm to go? This is no weather for standing around." The question brought reality crashing back. She had the wagon, yes, but nowhere to put it, no way to feed the horse that pulled it, assuming she could even afford to get the horse back from the livery where it was being kept as collateral. The wagon solved one problem but left a dozen others unsolved. "I will manage," she said, trying to sound confident. Wade studied her face and seemed to see right through the lie. "Have you eaten today?" She lifted her chin. "That is none of your concern." "That is a no, then." He gestured toward the main street. "There is a restaurant, nothing fancy, but the food is hot and filling. Let me buy you a meal, at least. You can tell me about your situation, and perhaps I can offer some advice." Every instinct told Tessa to refuse, to maintain her dignity and independence. But her stomach was hollow with hunger, and the cold was seeping into her bones, and this man had just done something incredibly generous for her. The least she could do was accept a meal. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." They walked together through the streets of Downeyville, past the shops and saloons that lined the main thoroughfare. The town was nestled in a narrow valley where the North Yuba River met Downey Creek, surrounded by towering pines and steep mountain slopes. It had been a booming mining town in the 1850s, but by 1882, much of the gold was gone, and the town had settled into a quieter existence. Still, there were enough miners and loggers and ranchers passing through to keep the businesses going, and the restaurant Wade led her to was warm and inviting, with steamed windows and the smell of coffee and bacon in the air. They took a table near the back, and Wade ordered for both of them, beef stew and bread and coffee. Tessa wrapped her hands around the coffee cup when it arrived, letting the heat seep into her fingers. Across from her, Wade removed his hat and set it on the chair beside him, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was handsome in a rugged way, with a straight nose and a firm mouth, but it was his eyes that struck her most, the way they seemed to look past surfaces to something deeper. "Tell me about yourself," Wade said, adding sugar to his coffee. "How long have you been in Downeyville?" Tessa hesitated, unused to talking about herself. "My father and I arrived last spring. He had heard there was still gold to be found in the creeks around here, and he wanted to try his luck. We worked a claim all summer, but we found nothing of value. Then the winter came early and he caught sick." She paused, the memory still painful. "He died in October." "I am sorry," Wade said, and he sounded like he meant it. "After he passed, I discovered the debts. He had borrowed money from the general store, from the boarding house, from several individuals in town. I have been trying to pay it back by taking in washing and sewing, but it is not enough, not nearly enough." She took a sip of coffee, grateful for the warmth. "They gave me until the end of January, and when I could not pay, they took the wagon." Wade was quiet, listening with his full attention. The stew arrived, thick and rich with chunks of beef and vegetables, and Tessa ate slowly, trying not to show how ravenous she was. Wade ate his own meal without comment, giving her space to collect herself. "What will you do now?" he asked when they were both halfway through their bowls. "I do not know," Tessa admitted. "I thought perhaps I could travel to Sacramento or San Francisco, find work there. But now, with the wagon back, I have more options, though I still need to figure out how to get my horse from the livery and how to afford supplies for traveling." Wade set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair, considering. "I have a proposition for you if you are willing to hear it." Tessa felt a flutter of nervousness. "What sort of proposition?" "Nothing improper," Wade said quickly, seeing her wariness. "I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here, up in the mountains. It is not large, maybe 200 acres, but I run cattle and horses and I do well enough. The problem is, I have no one to help with the household. I can cook for myself after a fashion, but the house is a disaster. My clothes are falling apart, and I could use someone to help with the chickens and the garden come spring." He met her eyes directly. "I am offering you a job, Miss Zimmerman. Room and board plus $30 a month. You could stay in the wagon if you prefer privacy, or there is a spare room in the house. Either way, you would be warm and fed, and you could save money for whatever future you want to build." Tessa set down her own spoon, her mind racing. It was a generous offer, almost too generous. "Why would you do this? You have already done so much." "Because I need the help," Wade said simply. "And because you need a safe place to land. It seems like it would benefit us both." She wanted to accept immediately, but caution held her back. "I do not know you, Mr. Nelson. For all I know, you could be a dangerous man." "That is fair," Wade acknowledged. "Ask anyone in town about me. I have been ranching here for 5 years, and I have never caused trouble for anyone. Talk to Sheriff Morrison, or to Reverend Clay at the church, or to any of the shopkeepers. They will tell you I am honest." Tessa appreciated that he did not take offense at her wariness. It showed he understood the precarious position women were in, especially women alone. "Give me until tomorrow to decide," she said. "I will make inquiries and then I will give you my answer." "That is perfectly reasonable," Wade said. He finished his stew and signaled for more coffee. In the meantime, where are you staying tonight? The boarding house, for one more night. I paid for it yesterday. Good. Then you will be warm at least. He poured cream into his coffee and stirred it thoughtfully. I will be staying at the hotel tonight, and I plan to head back to the ranch tomorrow afternoon. If you decide to accept my offer, meet me at the livery stable at noon. I will pay to get your horse released, and you can follow me up to the ranch. They finished their meal in companionable silence, and when they stepped back out into the cold, the afternoon shadows were already lengthening. Wade walked Tessa back to her wagon, which still sat in the town square, looking forlorn and battered but blessedly hers once more. "Thank you again," Tessa said, touching the wagon side as if to reassure herself it was real. "For everything." Wade tipped his hat to her. "Until tomorrow, Miss Zimmerman. I hope you will decide to come to the ranch, but if you choose another path, I wish you well." He walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly down the street, and Tessa watched him go with a confused tangle of emotions in her chest. Gratitude, certainly, and relief, but also something else, something that felt almost like hope. She spent the rest of the afternoon and evening making inquiries, just as Wade had suggested. She spoke to the sheriff, a gruff man in his 50s who had nothing but good words for Wade Nelson. Quiet fellow, keeps to himself mostly, but honest as the day is long. Pays his bills on time, helps his neighbors when they need it, never been a lick of trouble. Reverend Clay, a kind-faced man with white hair and gentle eyes, was equally complimentary. "Wade is a good man, Miss Zimmerman. He comes to services most Sundays when the weather permits. He lost his own father a few years back, and I think it left him with a strong sense of wanting to do right by people. If he has offered you work, I would trust his intentions are pure." Even Mrs. Henderson at the general store, whose husband had been the auctioneer that morning, had nothing but praise. "Wade Nelson is one of my best customers. Always polite, never complains about prices, and he once helped my son fix our roof when it was leaking. If he is offering you a position, you would be fortunate to take it." By the time Tessa returned to the boarding house that evening, her mind was made up. She would go to the ranch. It was the most sensible option, and something in her gut told her that Wade Nelson was exactly what he appeared to be. A good man trying to help someone in need. She slept better that night than she had in months, wrapped in thin blankets in her small rented room. And when morning came, she felt a sense of purpose she had not experienced since her father died. She packed her few belongings, settling her small account with the boarding house, and made her way to the livery stable just before noon. Wade was already there, talking with the livery owner, a wizened old man named Garrett. When he saw Tessa approaching, Wade's face broke into a smile, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire countenance. "You came," he said, and there was genuine pleasure in his voice. "I asked around just as you suggested," Tessa replied. "Everyone speaks well of you, so yes, I would like to accept your offer if it still stands." "It absolutely stands." Wade turned back to Garrett. "Go ahead and release Miss Zimmerman's horse. I will cover whatever is owed." The transaction took only a few minutes. Tessa's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, was brought out and hitched to the wagon. The mare nickered softly when she saw Tessa, and Tessa stroked her nose, murmuring words of greeting. Wade settled the debt, which was more than Tessa had feared, and then led her to where his own horse was tied, a tall black gelding with intelligent eyes. "The ride to the ranch takes about 3 hours at wagon pace," Wade explained as he swung into his saddle. "The road is decent for the first part, but it gets rougher as we climb into the mountains. Stay close, and if you have any trouble, just call out." Tessa climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, feeling a surge of gratitude that she had not lost this skill despite months of uncertainty. "I will be fine. Lead the way, Mr. Nelson. Call me Wade," he said. "We are going to be working together after all. No need for formality. Then you must call me Tessa." He nodded, that small smile playing at the corners of his mouth again, and then he turned his horse and started north out of town. Tessa followed, the wagon creaking and swaying beneath her, Copper's hooves clopping steadily against the frozen ground. They left Downieville behind, following a narrow road that wound along the river, and then began to climb into the foothills. The landscape was breathtaking despite the harsh season. Tall pines dusted with snow, granite cliffs rising stark against the pale sky, the occasional glimpse of a frozen creek cutting through the rocks. Wade rode ahead but not too far, constantly checking over his shoulder to make sure Tessa was managing. She appreciated his consideration, though she did not need it. She had been driving wagons since she was a girl, and Copper was a steady, reliable animal. They stopped once to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of bread and cheese that Wade had brought. They sat on a fallen log by the side of the road, watching the horses crop at the dry grass that poked through the snow. "Tell me about your ranch," Tessa said, pulling her shawl tighter. "What is it like?" Wade chewed thoughtfully before answering. "It is quiet, peaceful. The house is nothing fancy just for rooms, but it is solid and warm. There is a barn for the horses and cattle, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and a root cellar. The land is good, with a creek that runs year-round and enough pasture for grazing. I have about 30 head of cattle right now and half a dozen horses that I am training to sell." "It sounds lovely," Tessa said honestly. "It is home," Wade replied. "I bought the land 5 years ago with money I had saved from working in the mines. I never found much gold myself, but I was careful with what I earned, and when I had enough I decided I would rather build something permanent than keep chasing a dream." He glanced at her. "What about you? What did you do before you came to California?" "We lived in Missouri, near Independence. My mother died when I was 14, and after that it was just my father and me. He was a dreamer, always convinced the next opportunity would be the one that made our fortune. We tried farming, but the land was poor. We tried running a store, but there was too much competition. Finally, he heard about gold in California, and he was determined to try prospecting." Tessa sighed. "I knew it was a long shot, but I could not let him go alone, so I came with him." "That was brave of you, or foolish." Tessa smiled sadly. "But he was my father. I loved him, even when he made impractical choices." Wade nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Family is everything. My father was the most practical man I ever knew, but even he made mistakes. The important thing is he taught me the value of hard work and integrity. Those lessons have served me well." They mounted up again and continued the journey. As they climbed higher, the snow grew deeper and the air grew colder. Tessa was grateful for the thick coat Wade had insisted she borrow from the general store that morning, paying for it himself despite her protests. The sun was low on the horizon when they finally crested a rise and Wade pointed ahead. "There it is. That is home." Tessa looked and felt her breath catch. The ranch sat in a sheltered valley, surrounded by pines and protected from the worst of the wind. The house was indeed simple, a log structure with a stone chimney from which smoke was rising, and there were several outbuildings arranged around a central yard. It looked sturdy and welcoming, a place where a person could feel safe. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Wade looked pleased. "Come on. Let us get you settled before dark." They descended into the valley, and as they approached the house, Tessa saw details she had missed from a distance. The neat fences, the well-maintained barn, the garden plot that would surely be lush come spring. A few cattle grazed in a nearby pasture, and chickens scratched in a fenced run beside the coop. It was exactly the sort of place she had always dreamed of, the kind of permanent home her father's restlessness had never allowed them to have. Wade dismounted and came to help her down from the wagon. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, and she felt a strange flutter in her stomach at his touch. She pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that this was a business arrangement, nothing more. "Let me show you the house first," Wade said, leading the way. "Then we can get your horse settled and bring in your belongings." The inside of the house was dim but warm, heated by a fire in the stone fireplace. As Wade had warned, it was not fancy, but it was clean enough and solidly built. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a sturdy table, a few chairs, and a cast iron stove. There were 2 doors leading to what must be bedrooms, and a ladder leading up to a small loft. "That is my room," Wade said, pointing to the door on the left. "The other room was my father's, but it has been empty since he passed. You are welcome to it, or you can stay in your wagon, whatever makes you most comfortable." Tessa walked to the second door and opened it, peering inside. The room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out over the valley. It was far more private and warm than the wagon would be. "I will take the room," she said decisively, "if you are certain you do not mind. I would not have offered if I minded." Wade moved to the stove and checked the fire. "I will show you where everything is tomorrow. Tonight, let us just get settled. I will make supper and you can rest. You have had a long day." Tessa wanted to protest, to insist on helping, but exhaustion was catching up with her. "All right. Thank you." They worked together to bring in her belongings, which did not take long since she had so few. Wade carried the heavier items while Tessa brought in her personal effects, the Bible and photographs and quilt that meant so much to her. She arranged them in the small bedroom, and for the first time in months, she felt like she had a space that was truly hers. Wade made supper, a simple meal of fried potatoes and bacon, and they ate together at the table. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer awkward, and Tessa found herself relaxing in a way she had not been able to for a very long time. "I want to be clear about expectations," Wade said as they were finishing. "You are here to help with the household tasks, cooking and cleaning and such. But you are not a servant, Tessa. You are an employee, and I will treat you with respect. If there is ever anything that makes you uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. Understood?" "Understood," Tessa said, appreciating his directness. "Good. Now, I imagine you are exhausted, so feel free to turn in whenever you like. I am usually up before dawn to tend the animals, but there is no need for you to rise that early. Come out when you are ready, and I will show you the routine." Tessa nodded, and after helping wash the dishes, she retreated to her new room. She changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the quilt on the bed, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt safe. The house was warm, the bed was comfortable, and outside her window the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. She thought about Wade, about his unexpected kindness, and the way he had given her back not just her wagon but her dignity and her hope. She barely knew him, and yet she trusted him in a way that surprised her. There was something solid about him, something utterly dependable. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, and when Tessa woke the next morning to the sound of Wade moving around in the main room, she felt more rested than she had in months. She dressed quickly and emerged to find him stoking the fire and setting a pot of coffee on the stove. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a long time," Tessa admitted. "Thank you. "No need to thank me. You are earning your keep." He gestured to the shelves above the counter. "I am afraid my food supplies are somewhat limited. I usually live on coffee, bacon, beans, and bread. If you have ideas for more varied meals, I am happy to buy whatever ingredients you need the next time I go to town." Tessa surveyed the shelves and the root cellar that Wade showed her, taking stock of what was available. There were potatoes and onions, dried beans and rice, flour and cornmeal, a few tins of vegetables, and some preserved meat. It was basic, but she could work with it. "I can make do with what is here," she said. "Though some fresh vegetables would be nice once spring comes. You mentioned a garden." "There is a plot behind the house. It did not produce much last year because I did not have time to tend it properly, but if you want to take that on, I would be grateful." "I would like that," Tessa said, already imagining what she could grow. They spent the morning together as Wade showed her around the ranch. He introduced her to the chickens, explaining how often to collect eggs and what to feed them. He showed her the barn where the cattle took shelter during storms and the corral where he worked with the horses. He pointed out the creek that provided water and the woodpile that needed constant replenishing during winter. Tessa absorbed it all, asking questions when she needed clarification, and Wade answered patiently. He was a good teacher, she realized, clear and thorough without being condescending. And he was attentive to her comfort, making sure she was not too cold, offering her his gloves when he noticed her hands were red. By midday, Tessa felt like she had a reasonable grasp of the ranch's rhythms. Wade went out to check on the cattle in the far pasture, and Tessa set about making lunch. She found some dried beef and made a stew with potatoes and onions, using herbs she found hanging in the kitchen. When Wade returned, cold and hungry, he praised the meal enthusiastically. "This is the best thing I have eaten in months," he said, and she could tell he meant it. They fell into a routine over the following weeks. Wade handled the outdoor work, tending the animals and repairing fences and cutting firewood. Tessa managed the household, cooking meals that were simple but nourishing, washing clothes, mending, keeping the house clean. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Wade reading or working on leather tack while Tessa sewed or wrote letters she could not afford to send. It was a quiet life, but Tessa found she did not mind. After months of uncertainty and fear, the predictability was soothing. And Wade was easy to live with, respectful of her space, kind in his words, never demanding or harsh. They talked sometimes, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, but they were equally comfortable in silence. As January turned to February, the worst of the winter began to ease. The days grew incrementally longer, and though snow still fell, there were occasional afternoons when the sun broke through and the temperature rose above freezing. Tessa began to plan the garden, sketching out where she would plant vegetables and herbs, and Wade promised to help her turn the soil when the ground thawed. It was during one of those rare sunny afternoons that Tessa realized her feelings for Wade had shifted from gratitude to something deeper. She was in the barn, collecting eggs, when she heard him talking to one of the horses. His voice was low and gentle, murmuring words of praise as he brushed the animal's coat. Tessa stood in the doorway, watching him, and felt her heart constrict with an emotion she had not expected. She was falling in love with him. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Wade had never given her any indication that he saw her as anything other than an employee, a woman he had helped out of kindness. And yet, there were moments when she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. Moments when their hands brushed, and she felt a spark of electricity. Moments when she thought perhaps, just perhaps, he might feel something too, but she said nothing. She could not risk her position here. the safety and security she had finally found. So she kept her feelings locked away and focused on her work, on being the best employee Wade could ask for. March arrived with a burst of warmer weather. The snow melted rapidly, turning the ground to mud, and the creek swelled with runoff. Wade took advantage of the conditions to make a trip to Downeyville for supplies, and he invited Tessa to come along. She agreed eagerly, happy for a change of scenery and a chance to restock the kitchen. They made the journey in a single day, leaving early and arriving in town by late morning. Wade conducted his business efficiently, buying seed for the garden, nails and wire for repairs, and whatever food items Tessa requested. They had lunch at the same restaurant where Wade had first taken her, and Tessa was amused to see the curious looks they received from the other patrons. She supposed people were wondering about the nature of their relationship, and she could hardly blame them. On the way back, as the wagon jostled over the rough road, Wade was quieter than usual. Tessa sensed something was on his mind, and finally, as they were climbing into the foothills, he spoke. "Tessa, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, curious. He was quiet for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "Are you happy at the ranch? I mean, truly happy, not just making the best of a difficult situation?" The question surprised her. "Yes," she said honestly. "I am happy. Happier than I have been in a long time. Why do you ask?" Wade kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Because I want to make sure you do not feel trapped. You came to the ranch out of necessity, and I do not want you to stay only because you feel you have no other options. If you want to leave, to go to Sacramento or San Francisco or anywhere else, I will help you. I will give you the wages you have earned, plus extra to get you started, and I will not think less of you for it." Tessa felt a pang in her chest. Was he trying to get rid of her? Had she done something wrong? "Do you want me to leave?" "No," Wade said quickly, and there was an intensity in his voice that startled her. "No, I do not want you to leave, but I want you to stay because you want to, not because you feel obligated." "I do want to stay," Tessa said softly. "I like the ranch and I like the work, and I like you, Wade. You have been kinder to me than anyone in my life, and I am grateful for that." Wade glanced at her then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "I am glad," he said, his voice rough, "because I have come to depend on you, Tessa. Not just for the work you do, but for your company. The house feels like a home now, in a way it never did before." They looked at each other for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, and then Wade turned his attention back to the road. Tessa's heart was pounding, and she wondered if he could hear it. She wanted to say more, to tell him how she felt, but fear held her back. What if she was misreading the situation? What if he was only speaking as an employer, grateful for a competent worker? They arrived back at the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They unloaded the supplies together, working in companionable silence, and then Wade excused himself to check on the animals. Tessa went inside to start supper, her mind churning with thoughts and questions. Over the next few weeks, the tension between them grew. It was subtle, a awareness that had not been there before, a heightened sensitivity to each other's presence. Tessa found herself noticing small things about Wade, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands, the sound of his laughter. And she caught him watching her sometimes, his gaze lingering on her face as she worked. April brought the first real signs of spring. Green shoots appeared in the pastures, wildflowers bloomed on the hillsides, and birds returned to sing in the trees. Tessa and Wade worked together to prepare the garden, turning the soil and building raised beds. It was hard physical labor, and they often ended the day exhausted and covered in dirt. But there was a satisfaction in it, a sense of building something together. One evening, After a particularly long day in the garden, they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. Wade had brought out 2 cups of coffee, and they sipped in comfortable silence. Tessa felt content, more at peace than she had ever been, and she found herself thinking that she could happily spend the rest of her life like this, working the land alongside Wade. "Tessa," Wade said suddenly, breaking the silence, "there is something I need to tell you." Her heart jumped. "What is it?" He set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "I have not been entirely honest with you. I mean, I have not lied, but I have not been forthcoming about my reasons for helping you." Tessa felt a flutter of nervousness. "What do you mean?" Wade took a deep breath. "The truth is, I noticed you months ago before your father died. I used to see you in town sometimes, and I was struck by you. Your strength, your dignity, the way you carried yourself despite difficult circumstances. I wanted to introduce myself, but the opportunity never arose. Then your father passed, and I watched you struggle, and it broke my heart. When they announced the auction, I knew I had to do something. So I bought the wagon, yes, but not entirely out of altruism. I did it because I cared about you, even though we had never spoken." Tessa stared at him, her mind reeling. "You cared about me, but you did not even know me." "I know it sounds foolish," Wade said, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "But there was something about you that drew me. And then when you came to the ranch and I got to know you properly, those feelings only grew stronger. Tessa, I have come to care for you deeply. More than I should, probably, given that you work for me and depend on me for your livelihood. But I cannot keep pretending I do not feel this way." Tessa's heart was racing. She wanted to believe what she was hearing, but part of her was afraid. "Wade, I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," Wade said quickly. "I am not asking you to return my feelings. I just needed you to know the truth. And I need you to understand that regardless of how you feel about me, your position here is secure. If you want to stay on as my employee and nothing more, I will respect that completely. If you want to leave, I will help you do so. But if, by some chance, you might feel something for me as well, then I would very much like to explore what that could mean." Tessa looked at him, at this good, honest man who had saved her and given her a home and was now laying his heart bare before her. She thought about the past months, about the quiet joy she had found in their daily routines, about the way her heart lifted every time she saw him smile. And she knew what her answer was. "I do feel something for you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have been trying not to because I did not want to complicate things, but I cannot help it. I think I started falling in love with you the day you bought my wagon and set me free." Wade's face transformed, hope and joy and relief washing over his features. "Truly, truly," Tessa confirmed, and then she found herself laughing, giddy with the release of all the emotions she had been holding back. "I love you, Wade Nelson. I love your kindness and your integrity and the way you care for everything and everyone around you. I love the life we have built here together, and I cannot imagine being anywhere else." Wade reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I love you too, Tessa Zimmerman. I have loved you for longer than I dared admit, even to myself." They sat there on the porch, holding hands and looking at each other, and Tessa felt a surge of pure happiness. Everything she had lost, everything she had been through, had led her to this moment, to this man, to this place. It felt like destiny. Wade leaned closer, his eyes searching her face. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Tessa whispered, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and reverent, and she felt like she was coming home. The kiss was sweet and tender, full of promise and hope. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling, and Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said softly. "I want to court you properly with all the respect you deserve, And when the time is right, if you will have me, I want to marry you." "I would like that," Tessa said, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I would like that very much." They spent the rest of the evening talking, making plans, sharing dreams. Wade told her about his hopes for expanding the ranch, about wanting to build a bigger herd and maybe add sheep. Tessa talked about the garden she wanted to create, about teaching children someday if the opportunity arose, about building a life filled with purpose and love. When they finally went inside, Wade walked her to her bedroom door and kissed her good night, a chaste touch of his lips to her forehead. "Sleep well, my love." "You too," Tessa murmured, and she went to bed feeling like the luckiest woman in the world. Their courtship was everything Tessa could have hoped for. Wade was attentive and romantic, bringing her wildflowers from the meadows, reading poetry to her in the evenings, teaching her to ride so they could explore the ranch together on horseback. They still worked side by side during the day, but now there were stolen kisses in the barn, hands held across the dinner table, whispered words of love under the stars. In May, Wade took Tessa to Downeyville and bought her a beautiful dress, pale blue with white lace, finer than anything she had ever owned. He also bought her a pair of proper boots and a warm coat for next winter. Tessa protested the expense, but Wade would not hear it. "You deserve beautiful things," he said firmly, "and I want to give them to you." They attended church together that Sunday, and Tessa noticed the approving smiles from the townspeople who had helped her when she first inquired about Wade. Reverend Clay shook their hands warmly after the service and told them he hoped to see them again soon, and Tessa had the feeling he knew exactly what was developing between them. June arrived with warm sunshine and long days. The garden was flourishing under Tessa's care, rows of vegetables growing green and lush. The cattle were sleek and healthy, and Wade had sold 2 of his trained horses for excellent prices. The ranch was prospering, and so were they. One evening, as they sat by the creek watching the water flow past, Wade turned to Tessa with a serious expression. "I know we have only been courting for a few months," he said, "but I have known you for longer, and I know my own heart. Tessa, I do not want to wait any longer. Will you marry me?" Tessa felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Wade pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to me before he died, told me to save it for the woman I would marry. I cannot think of anyone more deserving to wear it than you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Tessa looked at it through her tears, at the way it caught the evening light, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the path her life had taken. They set the wedding for July, giving them time to make arrangements and for Tessa to sew herself a proper wedding dress. Wade wanted to invite the whole town, to share their joy with everyone, and Tessa agreed. These people had been kind to her when she needed it most, and she wanted them to celebrate with her. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a flurry of activity. Tessa worked on her dress in every spare moment, creating something simple but elegant from fabric Wade had bought in town. Wade cleaned and repaired the house, wanting everything to be perfect. They made plans for the future, deciding they would build an addition to the house once they could afford it, creating more space for the family they both hoped to have. On the morning of the wedding, Tessa woke with butterflies in her stomach. It was a beautiful day, the sky clear and blue, the temperature perfect. She dressed carefully in her wedding gown, arranging her dark hair in a style she had practiced, and looked at herself in the small mirror Wade had hung in her room. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. so different from the desperate, frightened girl who had stood in the town square 6 months ago watching her life be auctioned away. Wade had ridden to town the night before to stay at the hotel, observing the tradition that the groom should not see the bride before the ceremony. Tessa missed him, but she appreciated the gesture. Today would mark the beginning of their life together, and it felt right to approach it with reverence and tradition. She rode to Downieville in the wagon, Copper plodding steadily along the familiar road. When she arrived at the church, she found it already filled with people. It seemed like the entire town had turned out, all the shopkeepers and ranchers and miners who made up the community. Mrs. Henderson rushed forward to help her down from the wagon, exclaiming over her dress and fussing with her hair. "You look beautiful, dear," the older woman said warmly. "Wade is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Tessa replied honestly. Reverend Clay met her at the door of the church, his kind eyes twinkling. "Are you ready, Miss Zimmerman?" "More than ready," Tessa said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The ceremony was simple but moving. Tessa walked down the aisle alone, her head held high, and saw Wade waiting for her at the altar. He looked handsome in a new suit, his dark hair neatly combed, but it was the expression on his face that took her breath away. He looked at her with such love, such awe, that she felt tears prick her eyes again. They spoke their vows clearly and firmly, promising to love and honor each other through all the days of their lives. When Reverend Clay pronounced them husband and wife, Wade kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The reception was held in the town hall, with food and music and dancing. Tessa had never been much for dancing, but Wade led her through the steps with patience and grace, and she found herself laughing and spinning, happier than she had ever imagined possible. People came up throughout the evening to offer their congratulations and best wishes. Sheriff Morrison clapped Wade on the back and told him he had chosen well. Mrs. Henderson pressed a package of tea and spices into Tessa's hands as a gift. Even the auctioneer, Henderson, approached to offer his good wishes, looking slightly sheepish as he did so. "I am glad things worked out for you, Mrs. Nelson," he said. "You deserve happiness." "Thank you," Tessa replied graciously, and she meant it. She bore no ill will toward anyone, not anymore. Everything that had happened had brought her to this moment, and she would not change a single thing. As the sun began to set, Wade and Tessa slipped away from the celebration and began the journey back to the ranch. They rode together in the wagon this time, Tessa tucked against Wade's side, his arm around her shoulders. The evening was warm and peaceful, the mountains rising around them like protective guardians. "Are you happy, wife?" Wade asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Happier than I have words to express, husband," Tessa replied, savoring the new title. When they arrived home, Wade insisted on carrying her over the threshold, and Tessa laughed as he lifted her easily in his strong arms. Inside, the house was lit by candles Wade must have arranged before he left the previous day, casting a warm glow over everything. He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with such intensity that she felt her breath catch. "I love you, Tessa Nelson. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret marrying me." "I could never regret it," Tessa whispered. And then she kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into that kiss. Their wedding night was everything Tessa had hoped it would be, tender and passionate and full of discovery. Wade was gentle with her, mindful of her innocence, and when she finally fell asleep in his arms, she felt completely cherished and safe. The months that followed were the happiest of Tessa's life. She and Wade fell into new rhythms as husband and wife, still working together during the day but now sharing a bed at night, waking in each other's arms each morning. The ranch continued to prosper. and by autumn, they had saved enough money to begin planning the addition to the house. In October, Tessa realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure, and when she was certain, she told Wade over dinner one evening. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He jumped up from the table and swept her into his arms, spinning her around and laughing with pure joy. "We are going to be parents," he said in wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Tessa said, laughing and crying at the same time. "We are going to have a baby." Wade was impossibly solicitous during Tessa's pregnancy, constantly worried that she was working too hard or not resting enough. Tessa found it endearing even as she assured him she was perfectly fine. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and as winter came again, Tessa found herself reflecting on how different this year was from the last. A year ago, she had been alone and desperate, watching her wagon be sold in the town square. Now she was married to a wonderful man, carrying his child, secure in a home she loved. The transformation was so complete it sometimes took her breath away. The baby came in May, just as the wildflowers were blooming on the hillsides. The birth was long and difficult, with Wade pacing anxiously in the next room while Mrs. Henderson, who had experience with such things, attended Tessa. But when it was over, and Tessa heard the first cry of her son, she felt a surge of love so powerful it eclipsed everything else. Wade came in as soon as he was permitted, his face pale with worry until he saw that Tessa was all right. Then he looked at the baby in her arms, and his expression softened into something approaching reverence. "A son," he said softly, reaching out to touch the tiny hand with one finger. "We have a son. What should we name him?" Tessa asked, exhausted but content. Wade thought for a moment. "Thomas," he said. "After your father, he deserves to be remembered." Tessa felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Thomas Wade Nelson, it is perfect." They settled into the new rhythms of parenthood, learning together how to care for their son. Wade was a devoted father, spending hours holding Thomas and talking to him in that same gentle voice he used with the horses. Tessa watched them together and felt her heart swell with love. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Thomas grew into a sturdy, cheerful little boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. The ranch continued to expand, and Wade and Tessa built the addition they had planned, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor. Tessa's garden became the envy of the area, producing abundant vegetables and herbs that she shared generously with neighbors. In 1885, they had a second child, a daughter they named Margaret, and 2 years after that, another son they called James. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, and Tessa often paused in her work to marvel at the life she had built. She never forgot where she had come from, the desperation and fear of that winter day in 1882. It made her grateful for everything she had, and it inspired her to help others when she could. She and Wade became known for their generosity, always willing to lend a hand to neighbors in need, to take in a stranded traveler, to offer work to someone down on their luck. One day in the spring of 1890, Tessa and Wade took the children to Downeyville for supplies. As they walked through the town square, Tessa found herself standing in the exact spot where she had watched her wagon being auctioned 8 years before. She looked around at the familiar buildings, at the people going about their business, and then at her family beside her. Wade noticed where she was looking and took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The path that brought you here?" Tessa looked at him, at this man who had saved her and loved her, and given her everything she could have dreamed of. She looked at their 3 children, healthy and happy and secure. She thought about the ranch, about the life they had built together, about all the small joys and triumphs of the past 8 years. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "That was the worst day of my life, and it led to all the best days. I would not change anything." Wade smiled and squeezed her hand. "Neither would I." As they walked away, Thomas tugging excitedly at his father's hand and Margaret chattering about the ribbons she wanted to buy, Tessa felt a profound sense of peace. She had been lost, and Wade had found her. She had been trapped, and he had set her free. And in doing so, he had given her not just her wagon back, but her life, her future, her heart. Years continued to roll by with the steady rhythm of the seasons. By 1895, Thomas was 13 and already showing signs of becoming as strong and capable as his father. He loved working with the cattle and horses, and Wade had begun teaching him the business side of ranching, preparing him for the day when he might take over. Margaret, at 10, was her mother's shadow, learning everything Tessa could teach her about cooking and gardening and healing herbs. James, at 8, was the adventurer of the family, always exploring the furthest corners of the ranch and bringing home treasures he found. Interesting rocks, bird feathers, once even a baby rabbit that Tessa helped him nurse back to health before releasing it. The ranch had grown significantly over the years. Wade had purchased additional land from a neighbor who was retiring, expanding their holdings to nearly 400 acres. They ran a herd of 60 cattle now, along with a dozen horses that Wade trained and sold. The income was steady and comfortable, enough that they could afford small luxuries and save for the children's futures. Tessa had transformed the garden into something truly spectacular, with not just vegetables, but also medicinal herbs and flowers. Women from town sometimes came to her for remedies and advice, and she was always happy to share her knowledge. She had also started teaching a small Sunday school class at the church, finding joy in educating the younger children of the community. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the expanded porch they had built 2 years prior, watching the children play in the yard, Wade turned to Tessa with a thoughtful expression. "You remember when I told you that my father lost everything and a stranger helped him?" he asked. "Of course," Tessa replied, setting down her mending. "I have been thinking about that a lot lately," Wade said. "About how one act of kindness can change the course of a person's entire life. That stranger who helped my father, he probably never knew the full impact of what he did. But because of him, my father was able to rebuild. He taught me values that guided my whole life, and those values led me to help you, which led to all of this." He gestured at their home, their children, the life they had created together. Tessa understood what he was saying. "You want to do more to help others." "I want to establish something permanent," Wade said. "A fund maybe to help people in dire circumstances. Nothing huge, just enough to make a difference. What do you think?" Tessa reached over and took his hand, her heart swelling with pride and love. "I think it is a beautiful idea, and I think we should do it together." They spent the next few months working out the details with Reverend Clay and the town council. They established what they called the Helping Hand Fund, contributing a portion of their own savings and encouraging others in the community to donate what they could. The fund would provide small amounts of money or goods to people facing hardship, whether from illness, injury, or bad luck. It would not make anyone rich, but it might keep them from losing everything, the way Tessa almost had. The fund's first recipient was a young widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with 3 small children and mounting debts. The money from the fund allowed her to keep her house and buy supplies to start a small seamstress business from home. Within a year, she was self-sufficient and even able to contribute back to the fund. Stories like hers became common, and the Helping Hand Fund grew in both resources and reputation. People throughout the county heard about it and began contributing, and within a few years, it had helped dozens of families. Wade and Tessa managed it quietly, never seeking recognition, but the impact was undeniable. In 1898, as the century drew toward its close, Tessa and Wade celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. The children planned a surprise party, decorating the house with wildflowers and preparing a special dinner. Friends and neighbors came from miles around to join the celebration, filling the house and yard with laughter and music. As Tessa looked around at all the people who had become like family over the years, she was struck by the richness of their lives. They had built not just a ranch but a community, not just a home but a legacy. Late in the evening, after the guests had left and the children had gone to bed, Wade and Tessa walked down to the creek, just as they had on so many evenings over the years. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the sound of the water was soothing and eternal. "Do you remember the first time we came down here together?" Wade asked, his arm around Tessa's waist. "Of course, you asked me to marry you, and you said yes, making me the happiest man alive." Wade pulled her close. "I have loved you every day since then, Tessa, every single day." "And I have loved you," Tessa replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "You saved my life, Wade, not just that day in the town square, but every day since. You gave me purpose and hope and love. You gave me everything." "We saved each other," Wade said softly. "You made this house a home. You gave me children and partnership and joy. I was just existing before you came along. You taught me how to truly live." They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The years had brought challenges, of course, hard winters and sick animals and the ordinary struggles of life, but they had faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing season. As they walked back to the house, Wade suddenly stopped and turned to face Tessa. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" Tessa asked. "What would have happened if I had not been in town that day, if I had not bought your wagon? Where would you be now?" Tessa had wondered the same thing herself over the years. "I do not know. Sacramento, perhaps, working as a maid or a laundress, or maybe I would not have survived that winter at all." Wade's arms tightened around her. "I cannot bear to think about that, a world without you in it. But I am here," Tessa said, cupping his face in her hands. "I am here because you were brave enough to act, kind enough to care. And I will be here for the rest of my life, loving you and building this life with you." They kissed there under the stars, just as they had so many times before, and then walked hand in hand back to their home, to the bed they shared, to the life they had created. The turn of the century brought changes to the world around them. New technologies were emerging, and the wild frontier was becoming more settled and civilized. But the ranch remained a constant, a place of peace and tradition where the old ways still held value. In 1900, Thomas turned 18, a young man now, strong and capable and ready to take on more responsibility. Wade officially made him a partner in the ranch, and they began working on plans for expansion. Margaret, at 15, had developed a real talent for teaching and announced her intention to become a schoolteacher. Wade and Tessa supported her dream wholeheartedly, even though it meant she would need to attend a training program in Sacramento for a year. James, at 13, was still finding his way. He loved the ranch but also had a restless spirit that reminded Tessa of her father. She worried about him sometimes, but trusted that he would find his path in his own time. One day in the spring of 1901, a young man arrived at the ranch looking for work. He was thin and exhausted, his clothes worn, and he carried everything he owned in a small pack. He reminded Tessa instantly of herself all those years ago, desperate and frightened but trying to maintain dignity. His name was Daniel, and he told them his story haltingly. He had been working at a mine that had closed suddenly, leaving the workers without pay. He had no family, no home, and he had been traveling for weeks looking for any opportunity. Wade and Tessa exchanged a look, an entire conversation passing between them in that glance. Then Wade nodded. "We can use an extra hand around here. The pay is not great, but you will have room and board, and we treat our people fairly." Daniel's face lit up with hope and relief. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I will work hard, I promise." "I believe you will," Wade said, shaking his hand. "Come on, let me show you where you will be staying." As Wade led Daniel toward the bunkhouse they had built a few years earlier for occasional hired hands, Tessa watched with a full heart. They were doing for Daniel what Wade had done for her, offering a hand up when it was needed most. It felt right, like they were honoring the gift they had been given by passing it forward. Daniel proved to be an excellent worker, dedicated and reliable. He became almost like another son to Wade and Tessa, often eating meals with the family and joining in their Sunday church attendance. Over time, they learned more of his story, and it turned out he had a gift for working with wood. Wade encouraged him to develop this skill, and within a couple of years, Daniel was making furniture that sold well in town. In 1903, Margaret left for her teacher training in Sacramento. It was hard to see her go, but she was so excited and determined that Tessa could not help but be proud. Margaret wrote long letters home every week, full of details about her studies and the city, and Tessa treasured each one while Margaret was away. James began spending more time with a neighboring rancher who had a small mining operation. It turned out that James had inherited his grandfather's fascination with prospecting, and he showed real aptitude for understanding geology and ore deposits. Wade was initially disappointed that James did not want to focus on ranching, but Tessa reminded him that each child needed to follow their own path. "Just as you followed yours," she said gently. "You could have stayed in the mines, but you chose ranching instead. James is choosing what calls to him." Wade acknowledged the wisdom in her words and supported James in his interests, even helping him stake a small claim on the far corner of their property where James had found promising signs of mineral deposits. Thomas, meanwhile, was courting a girl from town, the daughter of the mercantile owner. Her name was Sarah, and she was a lovely young woman with a practical mind and a kind heart. Tessa liked her immediately and could see that Thomas was deeply in love. In the fall of 1904, Thomas asked for permission to marry Sarah, and both sets of parents gave their blessing enthusiastically. The wedding was held the following spring, a joyful celebration that reminded Tessa of her own wedding 20 years earlier. As she watched Thomas and Sarah exchange vows, she felt the poignant passage of time, the way one generation gave way to the next. Her son was beginning his own family now, starting his own chapter. After the wedding, Thomas and Sarah moved into a small house that had been built on the ranch property, giving them privacy while keeping them close. Sarah proved to be a wonderful addition to the family, pitching in with the work and bringing new energy to the household. Margaret returned from Sacramento in 1905 with her teaching certificate and immediately secured a position at the Downeyville School. She moved back home, commuting the 10 miles each day, and Tessa loved having her daughter back. Margaret threw herself into teaching with passion and creativity, and the children in her classes adored her. James, at 18, made a modest but real strike on his claim, finding a vein of silver that, while not enough to make him rich, gave him enough capital to invest in better equipment and hire help. He was happy and fulfilled, and that was all Tessa and Wade could ask for. In 1906, Thomas and Sarah welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Tessa, after her grandmother. When Tessa held her tiny namesake for the first time, she was overwhelmed with emotion. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that frozen town square to this moment of pure joy, holding her grandchild. "Thank you," she whispered to Wade that night as they lay in bed. "For everything. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." Wade pulled her close, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saying yes, for trusting me, for building this life with me. I could not have imagined anything better." The years that followed brought more grandchildren, as Thomas and Sarah had 2 more children, and Margaret eventually married a teacher she had met at a conference, a good man named Robert who moved to Downeyville to be with her. They had a child of their own, and the ranch was once again filled with the laughter of little ones. James continued his mining ventures with moderate success, and eventually partnered with a geology professor from San Francisco who was impressed by James's instincts. Together, they started a small but reputable mining consultation business. Wade and Tessa gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, letting Thomas take the lead while they enjoyed their role as grandparents and community elders. They still worked, of course, both of them too active to ever fully retire, but the pressure was less, and they had more time to simply enjoy each other's company. The Helping Hand Fund continued to grow and help people, now managed by a committee that included Reverend Clay, the sheriff, and several prominent citizens. Wade and Tessa remained involved, but were pleased to see it become a true community effort rather than just their personal project. In 1910, on their 33rd wedding anniversary, Wade and Tessa returned to the spot by the creek where he had proposed all those years ago. They were both older now, Wade's dark hair streaked with silver, Tessa's face lined with the marks of time and laughter. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people who had fallen in love in this very place. "You remember what you said to me that day in the town square?" Tessa asked, holding Wade's hand. "I said now you are free," Wade replied, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. "You were right," Tessa said softly. "You set me free, not just from debt but from fear and loneliness and despair. You gave me freedom to be happy, to love, to live fully." Wade brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "And you gave me purpose. Before you, I was just going through the motions. You showed me what it means to build something meaningful, to love someone completely, to create a legacy that matters." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and Tessa felt perfectly content. She had lived a good life, a meaningful life, and it had all started with an act of kindness from a stranger who became the love of her life. By 1915, Downeyville had changed significantly from the rough mining town it had been in 1882. It was more settled now, with better roads and modern conveniences. But some things remained constant. The mountains still rose majestically around the valley, the creek still flowed with cold, clear water, and the community still took care of its own. Wade and Tessa were in their 60s now, respected elders whose story had become part of local legend. People still talked about how Wade had bought Tessa's wagon and set her free, how that one act of kindness had blossomed into a love story that spanned decades and touched countless lives. They had 8 grandchildren now, ranging from baby Stephen, Margaret and Robert's second child, to young Tessa, who was 9 years old and already showing signs of her grandmother's practical wisdom. The grandchildren loved visiting the ranch, and Wade and Tessa delighted in spoiling them with treats and stories and patient attention. Thomas had fully taken over the ranch operations and was doing an excellent job, modernizing where it made sense while maintaining the core values Wade had instilled. Sarah was pregnant with their fourth child, and the family was thriving. Margaret had become the head teacher at the school, respected throughout the county for her innovative teaching methods and dedication to her students. She and Robert had built a lovely home in town, and their children were bright and curious. James's mining consultation business had grown beyond anyone's expectations, and he now traveled throughout California and Nevada, advising companies on where and how to dig. He had never married, claiming he was too restless, but he was a devoted uncle to his nieces and nephews. Daniel, the young man they had helped years ago, had become a master furniture maker with his own successful shop in town. He often credited Wade and Tessa with saving his life, and he had become one of the largest contributors to the Helping Hand Fund, wanting to pass forward the kindness he had received. One crisp October morning in 1916, Wade woke before dawn as he always had, even though he no longer needed to tend the animals. He looked over at Tessa, still sleeping peacefully, her hair completely gray now but her face as dear to him as it had been that first day in the town square. He thought about their life together, about all the moments big and small that had made up their decades together. He thought about the children they had raised, the grandchildren who bore their legacy, the community they had helped build and strengthen. He had no regrets. None. Every choice he had made, from buying that wagon to proposing by the creek to establishing the Helping Hand Fund, had been right. And the best choice of all had been loving Tessa with everything in him. Tessa stirred and opened her eyes, smiling when she saw Wade watching her. "Good morning, my love." "Good morning," Wade replied, reaching out to take her hand. "I was just thinking about how blessed I am." "We both are," Tessa said, squeezing his fingers. "We have had a good life, Wade, a very good life." They rose and dressed, moving with the slower pace of age but still capable and strong. They made breakfast together, a routine so familiar it required no thought, and ate while watching the sun rise over the mountains. Thomas stopped by later that morning with young Tessa and her brothers. "Father, Mother," he said, "the children were hoping you would tell them the story again. The one about how you met." Wade and Tessa exchanged amused glances. Their grandchildren never tired of hearing the story, and they never tired of telling it. They all settled in the parlor, the children arranging themselves on the floor, and Tessa began the tale. She spoke of her father's death, of the mounting debts, of that cold January morning when everything she owned was being sold. She described the crowd, the auctioneer's voice, the terrible certainty that she was losing everything. Then Wade picked up the story, explaining how he had noticed Tessa months before, how he had admired her strength and dignity, how he had known he had to do something when the auction was announced. He described buying the wagon, approaching her, speaking those words that had changed both their lives. "Now you are free." The children listened with rapt attention, even though they had heard it many times before. When the story reached the part about the proposal by the creek, young Tessa sighed dramatically, and everyone laughed. "That is the most romantic story ever," she declared. "When I grow up, I want someone to love me like grandfather loves you, grandmother." Tessa pulled her namesake close and kissed the top of her head. "I hope you do, sweetheart. I hope you find someone who sees your worth and chooses you every single day." After the children left, Wade and Tessa took their customary afternoon walk around the ranch. It was smaller now than it had been at its peak, as they had sold some acreage to Thomas and Sarah to give them more independence. But it was still beautiful, still home. They walked slowly, stopping often to admire a view or watch the cattle graze or simply stand together in comfortable silence. When they reached the creek, they sat on the bench Wade had built there years ago, a permanent memorial to the place where he had proposed. "Wade," Tessa said suddenly, "if you had to do it all over again, would you change anything?" Wade considered the question seriously. "Not a single thing," he finally said. "Everything we went through, good and bad, made us who we are. It brought us here. No, I would not change anything." "Neither would I," Tessa agreed. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat together as they had so many times before. Two people who had found each other, saved each other, and loved each other through all the years of their lives. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, Wade thought about the young man he had been, standing in the town square, making the decision to buy a stranger's wagon. He had not known then what that choice would mean, how it would shape his entire future. He had only known that it was the right thing to do, and from that one act of kindness, this entire beautiful life had grown. A life full of love and purpose, of children and grandchildren, of meaningful work and deep relationships. A life that had touched countless others through the Helping Hand Fund and simple daily kindness. "Thank you," Wade said softly, not sure if he was speaking to Tessa or to God or to the universe itself. "Thank you for all of it." Tessa lifted her head and looked at him, understanding in her eyes. "Thank you," she echoed, "for seeing me that day, for caring, for loving me." They kissed, gentle and sweet, a kiss that held 34 years of marriage, of partnership, of enduring love. And as they sat there by the creek, holding hands and watching the water flow past just as it always had, they both felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived, of love freely given and joyfully received. The sun set slowly, painting the sky in glorious colors, and Wade and Tessa remained there until the first stars appeared, reluctant to end this perfect day. Finally, as the air grew cool, they rose and walked back to the house, to the home they had built together, to the warmth and light and love that waited inside. Their story had begun in winter, with loss and desperation and a frozen town square. But it had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of kindness, the strength of love, and the possibility of redemption. From that moment when Wade had said, "Now you are free," they had both been freed, not just from debt or obligation, but into a life of meaning and joy and deep, abiding love. And as they settled into bed that night, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for so many years, they both knew that whatever years remained to them would be lived the same way. Together, grateful and still very much in love, the years continued to pass with gentle grace. Wade and Tessa grew older, their bodies slowing but their spirits still vibrant. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, as Thomas and Sarah's oldest daughter had married and started her own family. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, and the Helping Hand Fund, now endowed with contributions from throughout the county, had helped over 300 families in the 4 decades since its founding. The legacy of kindness Wade and Tessa had started continued to ripple outward, touching lives they would never know. In the spring of 1925, as the wildflowers bloomed on the hillsides and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Wade and Tessa made their way once more to the bench by the water. They were both in their 70s now, moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age but still independent and clear-minded. "You know what today is?" Tessa asked, settling onto the bench with a contented sigh. "How could I forget?" Wade replied, sitting beside her and taking her hand. 43 years ago today I asked you to marry me, right here in this spot. And I said yes, starting the greatest adventure of my life." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the water and the birds, feeling the warm sun on their faces. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses whinnying in the corral, the voices of their grandchildren playing near the house. It was a symphony of life and legacy, and they had created it together. "Tessa," Wade said quietly, "I want you to know that loving you has been the great privilege of my life. Every day with you has been a gift." Tessa turned to look at him, seeing the young man he had been beneath the lines and gray hair. "And you have been my salvation and my joy from that first moment in the town square to this very day. I love you, Wade Nelson. I always have and I always will." They kissed, tender and true, and in that kiss was everything: their history, their love, their gratitude for the life they had built. When they finally pulled apart, they sat together watching the creek, holding hands, perfectly content. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose, and Tessa leaned her head on Wade's shoulder, feeling utterly at peace. She thought about that desperate girl standing in the frozen town square, watching her life being auctioned away, never imagining that salvation would come in the form of a quiet cowboy with kind eyes and a generous heart. She thought about how Wade had spoken those words, "Now you are free," and how profoundly true they had been. He had freed her from debt, yes, but more importantly, he had freed her to hope, to love, to become the woman she was meant to be. And in return, she had given him everything she had: her love, her partnership, her life. Together they had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and kindness that would echo through their children and grandchildren, and through every person the Helping Hand Fund assisted. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Wade and Tessa rose slowly and made their way back to the house. They walked the familiar path, their steps perfectly synchronized after so many years together, and Tessa thought that this moment of simple togetherness was the truest definition of happiness she had ever known. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, filled with the evidence of their life together. Photographs of children and grandchildren, furniture Daniel had made for them, quilts Tessa had sewn, books they had read together on long winter evenings. Every object had a story, every room held memories, and Tessa loved it all. They prepared for bed with the ease of long practice, and when they finally lay down, Wade pulled Tessa close, just as he had every night for over 40 years. "Good night, my love," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Good night," Tessa replied, feeling safe and cherished and home. And as they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, they both knew with perfect certainty that they had lived well, loved deeply, and created something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. Their story, which had begun with a cowboy, a wagon, and 5 simple words, had become a testament to the transforming power of love and the endless ripples of kindness freely given. From that cold January morning in 1882 to this perfect evening in 1925, their journey had been marked by love, partnership, and unwavering devotion. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the creek sang its eternal song, Wade and Tessa rested in the peace of a life fully lived and a love that would never die.